Hey everyone, today I'm going to be teaching you how to make this Free People inspired dress. It definitely has beachy cottagecore vibes and features some adjustable ties. For this tutorial, you don't need a lot of materials. I got 3 yards of this super squishy double cotton gauze from Mood, and you need 3 yards because we're also going to be making some bias tape for the ties. Alternatively, you could purchase bias tape if you wanted to. And if your fabric is see-through, you may want to purchase additional fabric for a lining. And then you will just need some rings and sliders because we will be making adjustable straps for this dress. So first we're going to work on drafting the top of the dress, and you really only need 2 measurements. So this pattern is really just a rectangular piece, and we're gonna apply some sewing techniques to get gathered effects. Be sure to pause to read to see how I got these measurements. So here I am working on that measurement A. I'm going to measure from armpit to armpit and then add 3 inches to that measurement. And then your next measurement is going to be from the top of the bust to whatever desired length. I initially measured down to my belly button just to give me some extra room to work with, but I ended up chopping about like 2 or 3 inches off of that. And of course, don't forget to add the appropriate seam allowance. And with that, it's time to go ahead and make those measurements on your fabric, and you can go ahead and cut those out. You're going to need to cut 2. You'll need 1 for your main fabric and 1 for your lining, but I am using the same type of fabric for both of these pieces. Our first step here, we're going to be working with our main piece of fabric. Here I've got my main piece and my lining piece. And I'm just folding one of these, my main piece, in half, and I'm going to mark it with a pin, and that's just to mark the center front. And now that we have our center front marked, we're going to use this point to make 2 other markings for the buttonholes, and the buttonholes are going to be used for the ties that we place later in the dress. So you can see here I'm just pinning near that center front, kind of spacing these pins evenly and marking where I'm going to make those 2 buttonholes. And make sure you don't place these buttonholes too close to the top of the fabric. You don't want to be working within the seam allowance. Alright, and with all those markings in place, you can grab your buttonhole foot and get to work. Now, if you'd like, you can install a small piece of interfacing that's just a small square behind these 2 buttonholes, and that will help them retain their shape. You can use a seam ripper to open up the slits inside of the buttonhole, but with such delicate fabric, I prefer to use a pair of small scissors so that I have more control and I don't accidentally rip further than the buttonhole. And with that step complete, I have taken my lining piece and my main piece and I've just laid them on top of each other, and we're going to make some notches. These notches are going to serve as the openings for the ties on the dress and give us a nice clean finish. The more I watched this footage, I felt like it was difficult to understand what I was doing, so I made this little graphic, and each arrow is where I made a notch. So you can see the first one there is about an inch down from the top of the fabric, and then maybe another 5 inches down was the next notch, and those 2 bottom notches are spaced about an inch apart. Here's a closer look at those notches, and what's really fun is we are going to take these little pieces of fabric and fold them to the inside, to the wrong side, and we'll stitch those down. And here you can see I just have all my little notches pinned in place and ready to sew. So go ahead and stitch those down. You'll have 4 per piece to stitch down. And that provides this clean finish when you're wearing the dress from the outside. Then with right sides together for your lining and main fabric, mark with pins along the sides and the top of everywhere that needs to be stitched between those notches, and be sure not to catch your buttonholes there. Make sure you do not sew the openings shut and do not sew the bottom of the top yet. And when I'm sewing these two pieces together, I'm just lining up my seam allowance with the new edge that we created using those notches. After you've sewn those seams, it's time to turn the top to the right side. Give that a good press, and now we're going to be marking lines for the channels. These lines match up with the edges of the notches, the little openings that we created, and this is where we will be inserting the ties that we create later down the road. So the red dotted lines that you see there, that is what I am marking on my fabric right now. And once you have your lines marked, you can go ahead and start stitching those down using a standard stitch length. And again, be sure to not catch the edge of those buttonholes at the top. And once that's done, we're going to set that aside and talk about the skirt. So before we get into the skirt sewing portion of this tutorial, I wanted to talk about what different sewing patterns you can use. For this version of the dress that I made and for the brown version of the dress that I made, I used my most recent pattern release, which is called the midi skirt. And so as a thank you for making it this far to this video, I did create a special 50% off coupon for this sewing pattern, so you can go grab that for $4. Alternatively, I did want to make sure that you had some options for a free skirt pattern. So you could draft a really wide rectangular skirt, or you could draft a circle skirt. The most important part of picking a sewing pattern for the skirt portion is just that it's wider than your hips, because we're going to put in a drawstring, and that's kind of what helps contribute to that gathered effect. So whatever sewing pattern you use, for example, when I'm using the midi skirt sewing pattern, I'm not using the waistband portion of the sewing pattern. And I didn't walk you guys through on how to make this skirt pattern because I already have a full sew along for this sewing pattern. So again, I'm using the midi skirt and I am using the lined option. So regardless of the sewing pattern that you use for the skirt, similar to what we did on the top, I'm marking my center front and marking my first two buttonholes for the ties. Now you'll notice that I have pinned these about 1.25 inches away from the top, and that's because we're going to need a wider seam allowance to create another channel for the ties. So just make sure you don't do those too close to the top of the fabric. Now, if you are going to be using a lining for the skirt portion, this would be the time to do it. All of your construction steps are going to be rather similar. We just want to make sure we have those buttonholes created before we insert the lining. So I just basted the top of this lining to the top of the skirt and then treated it as one piece. But if you aren't using a lining for your skirt, honestly, you can just simply skip this step. Then it is time to finish the top edge of the skirt, and then we are going to set that aside and return to working on the top, and the rest of this is going to come together rather quickly. We need to finish the edge of this top as well as sew a basting stitch so that we could gather this top. So here I'm using a long stitch length to sew a basting stitch so that I can gather this down to our original armpit to armpit measurement. And while you're at it, you can go ahead and mark your center front because we're going to need it. With right sides together, we are going to line up the bottom of the top with the top of the skirt, matching our center fronts. And we're going to pin those together with a pretty wide seam allowance. And you can see there, I was just making sure that I was pinned right up to those buttonholes. And that's so that we have enough seam allowance to tuck this down for one of our channels. And here you can see that really wide seam allowance. It's about 1.25 inches. So you can go ahead and give that a good press, and with that it is time to create another channel for the tie that goes around the waist. So here you can see I am just tucking down that seam allowance and pinning it in place. And you're going to continue pinning that down all the way around the width of the skirt. And here's what that looks like all stitched down in place. You can see here again, I was careful not to shut my buttonholes, and it creates this nice channel. So now we need to start working on ties for the dress. I'll include a link on how to make bias tape out of the fabric that you're working with. You can also use store-bought bias tape if you don't feel like creating your own ties. But you're gonna need to make 3 ties, and each of these are about 3 inches wide. You need a tie that goes around your waist, a tie that goes around your midsection, right below the bust, and a tie that goes above the bust. Each of those 3 ties, I made them about 65 inches in length. Then for the adjustable ties, using the same width as the other bias strips, I cut 2 strips that were 18 inches long, and then 2 other strips that were about 4 inches long. And we're just going to sew all of those right sides together. Once you have all your ties created and sewn, go ahead and trim down that seam allowance, and then we will turn the straps to the right side out. You can use a loop turner to do this, but honestly, I think it's easier with a safety pin. And now it's time to make the adjustable straps. So we're gonna take those small little 4-inch strips and feed them through each ring. And then we're going to stitch that together. Once that's stitched together, I take that little piece of fabric and I flip that raw edge to the inside, and then we stitch that down again so that raw edge is concealed on the inside. So now it's time to pick up your slider and pick up 1 strap, and we are going to feed that up through one end and back out through the other. Near the end where the slider is, we're going to pick up one end and feed that through the ring. Now this is the tricky part. We're going to take that end and feed it through that inside bar. So I kind of just pull that fabric out a little bit just to give me something to work with. And I'm gonna feed that end up inside underneath the fabric that was already there, and then coming back down. My hands went a little bit off camera there, but when I flip this over, you'll be able to see what I mean. And here's a closer look. Now we're gonna fold that down and sew it to just one piece there. So with the adjustable straps complete, we're going to attach those to the dress. So this is the wrong side of the dress, and I'm making sure that the adjustable strap is also facing out the right direction. I'm just gonna tuck that little raw edge and attach it to the edge of the top. So we're just gonna tack that down, and I'm going to tack it down right over where we already have that line of stitching for the channeling. And then I'm also going to give it a little tack at the top, so that way the strap is secure. And make sure you also have the ring and the slider positioned so that those will be on the back of the dress. And this is just a close-up look of what that looks like when they are attached. You're almost there. Now it is time to insert your ties. So we're going to start with the very top channel, and this is the only one that you have to do anything particular with. So I'm going to use my safety pin and I'm going to insert it into one side here at a time. And then as I'm inserting that tie, I'm going to make sure that I slide each strap end through the tie. So that way the ties are inserted through the straps so that you can wear the dress properly. And then you're simply just going to repeat that process for the other two channels, although there isn't a strap to capture, so a little bit more straightforward. This is a great time to adjust the length of any of the ties if you wish, and then for the ends, you can sew them shut, but I just tied mine into little knots. And you've made it to the final step. I always hem my garments last in case I change any other measurements, but you're just gonna serge that edge, fold it in, and stitch. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment or you can email me. I'm always happy to help you troubleshoot. And I'll see you in the next one.